Hi, my name is Erin Cahill, and I'm the Digital Marketing and Communications Manager at the Case Impact Network. It is an honor to join you this afternoon and introduce two dynamic leaders. Today's event will be led by Jean Case, Chairman of the National Geographic Society and CEO of the Case Impact Network and the Case Foundation. Under Jean's leadership, the Case Impact Network is ushering in a new era of more inclusive capitalism. Her work focuses on unleashing business and capital as powerful forces for change, igniting next-gen investors to use their dollars for good, and encouraging investors to promote social change through impact investing. Jean will speak with Judy Samuelson about her new book, The 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Real Value in a Changing World. And together they'll delve into Judy's storied career, her lessons on leadership, activism, and social responsibility, and her timely call for all of us to play a more active role in reshaping the world we live in. As founder and executive director of the Aspen Institute Business and Society program, Judy has a unique vantage point from which to engage business decision makers and identify the forces that are moving the needle. Under Judy's leadership, Aspen has led a number of initiatives, including a 10-year campaign to disrupt Milton Friedman's narrative about corporate purpose and a partnership with Korn Ferry to rethink executive pay. She previously worked in legislative affairs in California, banking in New York's Garment Center, and ran the Ford Foundation's Office of Program-Related Investments, where I believe Jean and Judy first crossed paths. As you listen to today's discussion, we encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Jean and Judy will spend about the next 30 minutes in conversation, and we'll save the final 10 minutes to answer some of your questions. And now, let me pass it over to Jean Case.
Great, thanks so much, Erin, and thanks to all of you coming from such faraway places to join us today. We're super happy that you're with us. I have to tell you, I've been really excited about having this conversation with Judy, who is a true giant and pioneer in the field of the things we're going to talk about today, truly helping to shape and push forward business as a powerful force for good. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And, you know, I have to say, whether you've heard of stakeholder capitalism, whether you call it inclusive capitalism, capitalism for all, or you just want to see business transform to be better actors more broadly on behalf of society, I think there'll be something in this conversation for you. Judy's book is The 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Real Value in a Changing World. And I think it couldn't be any more timely as we look at how business is really tackling today some very, very significant societal and environmental challenges. And we'll hear some storytelling from Judy on that front too. So Judy, super excited to have you with us. I guess I was trying to figure
Thank you for having me.
Oh, well,
that was a very generous introduction. I appreciate it very much. Thanks for having me.
You know, I think it might be worth just quickly starting with your 6 rules so that we ground those listening. What are we talking about in terms of the 6 rules? And then I have a question I'm dying to jump in with to get us started.
Great. Do you want me to just kind of go through them?
Go for it. Yeah, quick overview.
So I'll move through them quickly, but I like to say, you know, these are new rules, but they're not all new. Some of these, it depends on what kind of business we're talking about. Some people have been working this way for a long period of time, and many of these forces that I talk about have been in place for a long period of time and been driving change for a long time. So, but the first one is really, it's about what's value made up of. I mean, it's, you know, when I went to business school decades ago now, you know, we were taught that the real value of the company was the kind of bricks and mortar, things you can measure and are easy to put on a balance sheet. Today, something like 85% of the valuation of companies relates to intangibles, things like trust, reputation, customer loyalty, access to natural resources. These, and the kind of big one, the license to operate, you know, like the kind of relationships. So these are hard to measure, and yet they're critically important and increasingly are a source of driving real change in business. The second one is all about the purpose of the corporation. You know, when, again, we all know that conversation has been alive for the last years, but, you know, it's no longer about shareholder primacy. That was a period of time where that was a narrative about purpose. Businesses serve many objectives beyond shareholder value. They make the choice about the purpose, and purpose is also revealed by how business actually operates. We could talk a lot more about that, and I'm sure we will. The third one is the reality that, that business, the kind of responsibilities of business are set way outside of the gate of the business. They're not in the control of the business. When I was first working in Sacramento after college, the mantra around business responsibility was, create jobs, pay your taxes. That was kind of the responsibilities of business. And we don't take either of those for granted today. Both of those have become more complex. And yet deep in the supply chain, there are other definitions of responsibility. Fourth, I call it accountability from the cafeteria. We make a lot of mention of consumers as being influential and investors being influential in the design or the kind of mantra about business. But employees are the most influential today. Employees, furthermore, are the allies of the company. So the old rule was minimize the cost of labor. The new rule is really, how do you engage employees to make sure that you've got the best eyes on both risk and competitive advantage, where the opportunity resides. Fifth is all about talent. The old mantra was that capital is king. Today, it's culture that's king. Culture totally trumps capital. Capital is actually, it's not a scarce resource. We're awash in capital, but getting the right and a robust base of how employees relate to one another, how the company, how its values are communicated, those are really important value drivers of value creation. And then finally, and this one is somewhat of an oxymoron, it feels like, but I think it's true, is that the old rule was about, that collaboration is what drives innovation. Increasingly, it's actually about co-creation. When the system itself is at risk, you can't do it on your own. You simply have to work in collaboration and co-create with others. There's great examples of that happening real time.
Great summary, Judy, and so much to unpack there. But if we can, I want to start with purpose. And you alluded to this, but for those of you that don't follow the play-by-play in this space, it was August of 2019 when the Business Roundtable, which is a large and prestigious organization made up of the CEOs of the nation's largest companies, they came forward with a restatement of the purpose of business. That's pretty significant when you think about it. And it was that document and that intent signed by, I think, 171 CEOs that really said a lot of things matter other than just our shareholders and our investors. There are a lot of stakeholders that create our value and help drive our business. It was really, for many, a very significant moment, but it wasn't lost on us that it was intention. It was words. It wasn't like that day there were 15 actions that everybody put out that said, this is what we're going to do about it. But talk, if you will, because you talk quite a bit in the book about purpose. And, what do you see when you're working with CEOs and they're really trying to think about purpose in a way that can drive their business forward?
So I think this is an area of massive change. There's what we say and then there's what we do. That's one easy comparison. But purpose is very much about the mindset of the executive and of the company. I'm a big believer in, or I'm very much drawn to systems change as a way of thinking. And, if you read about systems change, and we are talking about business systems, individual company in and of itself is a system. Businesses operate within other systems that are both influencing systemic change all the time, but also influenced by it. And the kind of the science of systems change is you have the most important piece of it is getting the mindset right to begin with, and that's really what purpose is about. It is abundantly clear. We now, we've had I dedicate the book to a wonderful woman named Lynn Stout, who sadly passed away of an aggressive cancer a couple of years ago now. And she was the one who taught me a lot about what the law actually says. She wrote a book called The Shareholder Value Myth. It's still a good read. That reminds us that under Delaware law, businesses actually have a lot of agency. You know, there's something called the business judgment rule that makes sure that you actually can plan and execute for what you think is in the best long-term interest of the enterprise. It doesn't mean that you can, you know, that investors don't have a place at the table, or that, you know, that there isn't a fiduciary duty that, you know, falls in that direction. But it certainly doesn't, it's not preeminent, and it's not more important than all of these other pieces that are so important to get right. So the way we usually say it is that business serves many purposes, but it's also the choice of the executive and the board to get clear about what are we really trying to do? And then what does that mean that we need to measure, and measure differently than maybe we have in the past? And then what are the ways in which incentives and other things may get in the way that make it hard for us to realize that purpose? The last thing I would say about purpose maybe is that purpose is truly revealed. You know, you can write all kinds of things, but we actually find out a lot more about what the real purpose of the enterprise is through the actions that business takes. And we've had some, you know, really tragic stories about that in the last decade and more. And we continue to learn from companies that have always been clear about a purpose that is robust, has, and connects the company back to something larger than just their own self-interest.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I do want to say to those joining us today, please put your questions in chat. We're going to get to your questions in about 20 minutes, and we really want to hear from you. So Judy, you use some examples, you know, in that first chapter, you talk about, you know, the role of trust and reputation and externalities, and all of that sort of play a role. If someone says they have this purpose, what's happening there and what are you doing about it? But you use some examples of companies who've gotten it right and companies who've gotten it wrong. And I just wondered, do you want to share with us whether it's, you know, the story of VW or Boeing, or talk a little bit about those journeys?
Well, those in both cases are not companies that got it right. They're companies that got it wrong. You know, Boeing, I mean, it's interesting. If you go back in time and look and see what their website said about the purpose of the corporation, their mission and their intentions, what becomes pretty clear is that they were already a little confounding of these things, I believe. What we learned through the tragic loss of 2 aircraft is that their real purpose was to make sure that they were beating Airbus, you know, that they were moving without the care that they could have written a book on. I mean, they are, you know, maybe premier American manufacturer. They understood everything involved in what it takes to build a quality product and to build an organization that is attuned to quality and to the health and safety of everyone who is involved in aircraft. So that one is, but then let's go back to another example that I talk about, which is Merck.
Yeah,
Merck is,
great story.
you know, the company is over 100 years old. It has origins in Germany. I wrote about a period of time that some of you may be familiar with, when the CEO was Roy Vagelos, and there was an unusual circumstance. This doesn't happen every day. They were moving down the road on a drug called Mexistan that they thought was going to have be able to play a role in cardiac problems, and turned out that it didn't work for what they thought, but it had this amazing kind of off list, you know, it was a cure for a horrible disease called river blindness, which is found in river valleys in Africa and beyond. And the decision was left to the executive team to say, what do we do now? No one who needs this drug can afford to buy the drug. No one who needs this drug can just walk into a drugstore where we can easily supply them the drug. And Mr. Vagelos spent months trying to find get somebody to pick up the patent and move with it. You know, he went to the White House, he went to the UN. And finally, when there was no other recourse, he said, we're in it. And we're in it basically as long as it will be needed in order to move forward. And so I had this incredible opportunity to sit with him for an hour when I was still at the Ford Foundation, and everybody would take your phone call when you were sitting at the Ford Foundation. And I sat with him for an hour in his office in New Jersey, and I queried him about this. And what I learned from that was so instrumental in my own thinking about purpose, because what became very clear is what made it easy for him to make the decision is he knew the scarce resource at Merck was their scientific talent. In order to fulfill the aim of Merck to really create life-saving well-being for patients and clients and customers of all kinds, that's what they needed most. And if he turned back on a drug that had this kind of remarkable promise, that he would be defying that piece that he knew was absolutely critical to their long-term success. That's what I began to think. That's what purpose is really about. That's when you're very clear, you know the direction you need to head. So I often, use that as an example to remind us that it's not easy, it's complicated, but purpose is really revealed, and Merck has played that game a long time.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you also write about culture, and of course the two are so closely tied together, and you mentioned that in the opening. I think a lot of people might say, what do you do? Because you tell great stories, whether, it's Salesforce or J&J or Herman Miller. There are a bunch of examples you give in the book of culture that's really alive and living the values of the purpose. What do you say to some of the folks who may say, I'm not sure we have that culture here. How do we get from here to where we need to be to really walk the walk of the purpose we want to have as a company? And can you give an example or two?
Well, I think that what do we do to get from here to there? I think today it's about employees. We've gone through a remarkable period of time where, this living through this disruption, if you will, this horrible time where so many people have suffered so greatly. And we really humanized companies in a way by being able to see inside a little bit about the tensions that are involved in actually delivering a critical service when that is going to put some of your employees at risk. I think there are some companies that have handled this better than others. There are companies that took some pretty bold steps to make sure that they were protecting their workers as best they could, but also giving them a pay bump in order to support them during this period and reward them for the risks that they were taking. Some companies have stuck with that. A company from whom this is just in their DNA as Costco. I don't write a lot about Costco, but it comes to mind in lots of different settings as a company that then stayed by this premium and is still paying a premium for their frontline workers. Not every company did. Some have backed off and have reverted back to their pre-pandemic pay scale. So I think it's an interesting time, but employees, we're not just talking about frontline workers here. We're talking about employees as being a great the kind of listening tour that companies have taken after crises, I think of Doug McMillan at Walmart after, these horrific shootings that happened inside of a week at 2 different stores. And listening to the employees helped him figure out what was the right thing to do next. And I could cite many other examples of that as well. I think it's an interesting moment where more companies are kind of learning from their employees or willing to take maybe some X steps, even though that may feel almost alien in terms of how we think about the kind of labor relations in the United States and in kind of our own history as a country.
Yeah, I think it's worth just kind of defining what we talk about when we say stakeholders, because as you point out, employees are critical stakeholders, but so is a supply chain, and so are customers, so is your community that you work within, and the planet basically that your business operates on. And it's funny, Judy, because before we were all quarantined, I was in the process of talking to 100 leaders after the BRT statement of purpose around stakeholder capitalism, many of them corporate CEOs, asking them, was there really going to be meat on the bone? Was this mostly words? How did they see things going forward? And this was pre-COVID. And, almost to one of them, they said, oh no, I think there's real intention here. We have to turn it into real action. But oh, by the way, if there's any kind of disruption in the economy, people will run away from stakeholder capitalism. And what you just said is exactly, I think, what many of us have witnessed, which is quite the opposite happened, right? We had a severe disruption in society and the economy. And in many ways, I think it advanced some of the stakeholder focus for many CEOs, right? When you think about the way they had to suddenly consider what are the needs of their employees to keep them safe, to be at work, or, to do what they need to do.
Right.
How do they ensure they have a good supply chain and are doing the right things so they get the toilet paper they need to sell to their customers and things like that. So I think it's funny, and even, as it relates to women, we've heard some CEOs say, as they've watched what their male employees are doing to try to manage that, being at home and working and having kids, that they have a whole new awareness of what it's like in the home for women, and particularly parents who are trying to balance kids. So it's kind of interesting. But what is your view about what COVID more broadly has done to the advancement of stakeholder capitalism?
I don't know if it's COVID per se, or if I can unwrap this COVID from the, you talked about the BRT moment when they ultimately released this kind of restatement about the purpose of the corporation. It took them a year. I mean, it was a deep dive into these questions. I'm not crazy about the word stakeholders. I have to be, let me put that out there. I think one of the realities is that it was easy for executives to sign on to this statement because, of course, they care about their employees. Of course, they care about the communities that they live in and their employees live in. Of course, they're concerned about the health of the supply chain and all of those things that we're all concerned about environmentally. And, climate has finally reached the matter where the Business Roundtable has a comprehensive statement on addressing climate change as well, which is a huge move. It took a long time. But I think stakeholders that language doesn't do enough to clarify the right path forward for the enterprise, because all stakeholders are not the same in every company and across different industries. Different pieces of the puzzle are more important, dynamic, critical to get right. And that's really what's involved if you're running an enterprise. And then I think there's a whole bunch of things that are holding us back, that are third rail issues that are hard to talk about. And so one of the things that I'm eager to kind of watch for and see if we can get to some of these hard to deal with questions. What are we doing about contract workers? When we contract out work, what is that really about? Because if it's just about efficiency, we're probably missing a piece of the puzzle, and what we could say today is part of the corporation's responsibility. How about tax avoidance? How much money is the company spending on tax avoidance? What firm are they engaging? What is the end of that? What's the right relationship between you and the community that hosts your enterprise, and what's the right tax to be paying? And how do we make sure that, we don't go through another round of complex tax negotiations, but, instead bring up the companies that have failed to rise to the renegotiated tax under the Trump administration? What does that really look like? Share buybacks would be another one.
Yeah. And, you also demonstrate in your comment on stakeholders as a word, just the storytelling needs, the nomenclature that we have to adopt to really be sort of even more inclusive in what we're talking about and give it context in the situation, right? Because like what you talked about with different businesses having sort of the weight of different stakeholders be different. If their employees can be customers of their products, that's a very different situation than a business where their employees are not necessarily customers, et cetera. So you raise good points. I will pivot. We have a first question from one of our audience members, Doug Spate. What are the most compelling examples of corporate leadership using their balance sheet and or their assets to send economic impact in underserved communities?
Well, we could be talking about that domestically, or we could be talking about it internationally. They would take on kind of different strategies, of course. I think that the most critical thing, and you're saying use a balance sheet, so I'm going to assume this is partly what is at least likely what you mean, is that this is about the business design. It's not use a balance sheet in the sense of let's free up some money that we can specifically invest in XYZ kind of an enterprise. It's really, I think, kind of pulling back and saying, where do we really have agency as a business? What are the choices that we make that if we engage deliberately and build the right protocols that can then be sustained by a business model that actually is going to benefit by having made these changes, where do we really have an impact? Certainly it's about pay and benefits and the conversation about contract work. Certainly it's about profit sharing. Are we engaging in profit sharing in a way that is equitable from top to bottom? It's these kinds of questions. The design of work, the structure of work has huge impacts for retails and shops or retail establishments, both consumer products as well as beyond. There's a lot of different things, and they're within the control of the enterprise, but it's really about the design of the company and the choices that exist for executives.
But sometimes, I think it's the last one, co-create to win, which was my favorite rule, just looking at the power of collaboration and particularly cross-sector collaboration. And you used examples there of Greenpeace working with McDonald's on the cod fisheries, for instance, and things like that. So do you see potential there for business to partner? And you also make the case that usually it is seen as a more urgent priority when there's a threat that is understood to the business. So, what would you say about that?
Well, of course, we're living through a moment of co-creation. And when we look back on this, the pace at which we managed to, as if I had anything to do with it, the pace of the vaccine, and what will eventually, we will get through this. That's going to be a story of collaboration. These drug companies cracked the code on this virus by sharing information, not just by competing fiercely. And there was collaboration between and among the producers of the vaccines and beyond, but also with government. So it's an interesting story because it was born of crisis. And I bet it feels really good to be an employee in one of these enterprises that has really, without a doubt, creating something of value that is building goodwill and will stand the test for a long period of time as having been an important thing to do. In the supply chain domain, I kind of feel like, depending on the company, I mean, there are such extraordinary things that companies are doing today. I'm thinking about Walmart, which, they've probably, because of their brand and because of their, just how ubiquitous Walmart is. Sorry, I was saying Walmart. Walmart's another example. I was actually meaning McDonald's. McDonald's has been the source of one campaign after another. They've been targeted as a campaign, but ultimately they've started getting ahead of the curve, and they have been playing a role of being the co-convener in a massive change strategy to clean up the supply chain to their own good ends. And the example would be sustainable beef. That is a messy supply chain. I won't try to do it justice here. I probably couldn't even try. But literally, beef comes from probably well over 100 companies, complex, all kinds of environmental implications, climate change implications of how we raise beef now. So, either get ahead of the curve and do it yourself, or somebody's going to target you, right? It's a complicated kind of dance here.
Right. Yeah, that's so true. In tech, two of the big breakthroughs required all competitors to work together. Certainly this was early days when I was in tech as well. Parental controls, we couldn't do that on our own. We needed standards, and we needed to lock arms and say what's right for society here. And similarly, in the earliest days, although I think there's a continuing need today that's emerged around the digital divide, partnered with NGOs, partnered together as competitors to really address those big societal challenges. Okay, a couple of questions I want to run. I'll start with Rebecca Harris. Some are concerned how the collective we reskill the huge number of people in our country who no longer have applicable skills that are relevant today. Is this the responsibility of corporations, government, or nonprofits? And we know that more people will not be displaced by robots, AI, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I think it is a responsibility of business. It's one of these domains that won't happen alone. But I think there's a number of things that companies are doing. And some of it is coming from the need to, again, build coalitions to drive the change. So we've seen some interesting things. There's a recent coalition announced by the CEO, the current CEO, Ken Frazier of Merck, and Ginny Rometty, who's now, I think, still chair of the board at IBM, but has stepped down as CEO. It's a coalition called 110. And one of the very specific things, it is about economic opportunity and equal access to jobs for across, great racial divides that exist in this country. And one of the things they're doing in coalition is to lean into this question of what are job requirements and what are the skills we actually need? And how do we reduce the bar for populations that have been harder to employ, and do it thoughtfully in a way that we can build the skills that we need with a more diverse population, than we've been able to achieve in our enterprise before. I think it's a really interesting example. PwC early on, before George Floyd was killed. I mean, early on in the conversation started when race was already becoming a bigger conversation in the country. Built a common platform for, there are many companies that have weighed in and have talked about their processes and protocols that they use on hiring and retention. So this is a domain where I think it's absolutely that, there was a time when I think it was more the job of the company to be dealing with their firm specific skills and development. And then I think it was kind of like, well, we'd rather have government take care of this for us. So I think it's coming back around, and it's going to be a huge issue around AI.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of activism on the part of a number of companies. IBM has done so much reskilling. Microsoft has invested in this space. Walmart with their Walmart Academy to get skills ready to apply at Walmart, et cetera. Okay.
I would be another one.
Yeah. As a consultant, Sarah Herberg, as a consultant often working with leaders in a change management capacity, how can I help raise the conversation and change around the third rail issues you speak of? I find these are so often the elephant in the room. So why don't you talk about what you mean when you say the third rail issue?
Well, let's go to the biggest third rail issue of all, CEO pay.
There you go, because that's going to be another, that's a large question that we're getting.
It's not about, everybody sees the same thing. We've also seen rounds of government regulation. It never does anything, but actually there have been unintended consequences going back to the 1980s in efforts to try to kind of, I think, build a more sensible relationship between the CEO's pay and the rest of the enterprise. But it's a third rail issue. Nobody wants to touch it. Boards don't really want to talk about it. This is one where I believe this firmly, that we're going to see massive change on boards in the next years. We're going to get through this current COVID crisis, and there's going to be a lot of people who have said, I've had enough Zoom calls to last me a lifetime. Thank you very much. It's time for me to step down. We know the pressure to make boards more gender and diverse by race as well. California has already passed a law that requires at least 3 women on boards, I think by the end of 2021. Having more women on boards, that's going to help. Women are more inclined to lean into these questions. We know this from our own years of work on CEO pay. So what's involved and what will move it forward? I think that's definitely a conversation that we're heavily engaged in now. But, it's about asking questions on boards. So it's about culture of boards and creating the space to actually lean into these questions about purpose. CEO pay hasn't really changed in decades. And yet we know that the job of the CEO has changed, is continuing to change. CEO is the leader of a community. They are responsibility for an ecosystem, not just for their own employees as well. And that means that we need to pay the CEO in the right relationship to the enterprise that they lead. We need to carefully consider what's the right relationship between the executive team and the rest of the enterprise. And we clearly need to pay more attention to how much do we intend to go to the shareholder? How much are we going to pay back in share buybacks and dividends versus retain for investment in those same employees we were just talking about that require development, require incredible investment to help migrate and kind of mitigate the significant changes that are coming our way. So we tend to talk about employees over here and think CEO pay has nothing to do with it. It's the design of the system.
Yeah.
As long as total shareholder return is the largest signal in pay packages, it's very hard to assure that we're authentically moving toward a more human enterprise.
Right. Well, I think there is clear data now, and there's a great spokesperson for Mark Benioff at Salesforce who talks about the fact that paying attention to multiple priorities and groups leads to outperformance, and having strong purpose does as well. And so you might see a time going forward where we're measuring what matters for the CEO compensation, just like we need to be doing in the business, right? Are our employees happy? What are we doing in our community, et cetera? Okay, David Burgess, how do you see the interaction of this discussion with the political environment in the time of hyper-partisanship? How can we reach across the aisle? So do you think some of these issues we can find a middle ground?
There was a moment back when, when business would say they didn't really engage in politics, but of course the money in politics has been a backstory of business and government for many years now. Again, it was probably the employees that caused so many companies to hit the pause button on money being spent after, the January 6th.
Right. Yeah. I'll look at it. Sure.
So, I wrote a piece then that said, let's make sure this isn't just a pause. Let's make sure this is really a step back and an opportunity to really say, what are we trying to achieve? What is the money that we are spending on both sides of the aisle? Is it in fact encouraging better harmony between and among? Why do you have to spend the money to be heard? It's not that your voice is being taken away. Clearly businesses will be listened to because they're important employers, they're important investors in goods and services and public infrastructure and the like. So business has a place at the table, like we all have a place at the table. But I do think this is an important moment to kind of step back and say, where are we actually allowing the kind of voice of the commons to come through versus special interests and kind of the tensions that underpin some of these divisions, I believe.
Yeah, in our work, Aspen is in DC. We're 6 blocks from the White House here. We've really worked with administrations on both sides of the aisle, as well as Congress, on a number of these matters. And I've always been impressed at how there can be a way forward, even in times of hyperpartisanship, around key things like the jobs and well-being of American citizens. And at the end of the day, we really are trying to make capitalism, work better for more people in more places, right?
Yeah, and business is a moderating influence. Let's be clear. Business, it wants certainty. Nothing is worse for business and business, interruption than the kind of lack of clarity on where we're heading on climate change, for a matter. That's why the Business Roundtable finally, I think, weighed in with such a strong voice on this. So, more to say on this, but business at the table, let's maybe wash out the money in politics piece that tends to, aim at key special interests. But business as a moderating voice in politics, I think, is critically important and has been over the last 6 months.
Yeah, and you saw Janet Yellen the other day say that she believes among the most important economic issues of our time is climate change. So, that's pretty significant coming from sort of the...
And her number 2 talked about inequality.
Right, absolutely. So, I want to close with just a couple things, but before I do, it feels like there are a lot of things we didn't get into, but at the end of the day, if you're looking at the business model reason or the value or cost reasons behind what we're talking about, at the end of the day, a lot of this is risk if companies aren't considering this. Yeah. Right? And we know, as I said earlier, particularly the longer term performance of companies that put these things first, they outperform. Just for a minute before we close out on, there's also a relationship between short-term and long-term as we think about these things. Do you want to comment on either of those things, sort of the role risk plays and the short versus long-termism?
Well, I'm looking at the wall behind me because I thought I have a list of them up here. Maybe it's right here. Here it is. I have this quote on my wall about the tyranny of metrics. It's a quote by a guy named Jerry Muller, because I think a lot of this kind of moment around short-termism and, you know, the cacophony of noise that we seem to be listening to, and that has actually, you know, raised a lot of important questions about disclosure by companies, and kind of amplified the need to kind of disclose more and you know, speak to the consequences of business decisions and their externalities and all of this. But ultimately, business is the real, it's business that's most is the most motivated to drive the change. Because as you just said, Jean, it's about risk. It's about having the freedom to get ahead of the curve on some of these consequential issues, whether it's climate change or the, you know, health of other ecosystems, and, you know, the access to, you know, labor, and being able to operate in an environment which you can actually help raise the bar on labor conditions and human rights and other things that bedevil you if they're not attended to, and if they are not part of your social contract, wherever it is that you have the license to operate. But this quote on my wall says, metrics lose their meaning when used to reward or punish performance rather than to diagnose and analyze. And I've been building a list of what I call surrogates. You know, so you mentioned risk. It reminded me of this list because I think there are things that are measurable that are not necessarily the kind of thing that the market is looking for, but I think business needs to help translate things. So retention is a good one. You know, there is a strong correlation between retention and alpha, outperforming. You know, things like customer service, you know, trust. Trust is another. It's measurable. We can measure trust. And trust is, we still suffer from a trust deficit in business. So there's other things like that that I think can be, help us break through the short-term, long-term debate and think about what really has to be true for us to succeed as an enterprise over the long haul. And I'm hopeful that in this moment, we get businesses that are, you know, they've been working with employee engagement scores now for over a decade. They have found those to be useful to them in understanding whether or not the employee gets what they're doing, wants to be there at work, is, you know, is kind of bringing all their energy and insight to their day job. And that's one, but there's more that we can do to kind of peel back, take some of the mystery out of this, and actually measure these things that are commonsensical.
Yeah, really good points, Judy. So I'm going to close us out with two quotes, okay? And thank you everyone who sent in questions. I'm sorry we didn't have even more time for your questions. So here's the quote, and you'll recognize it, Judy. Business and business leaders will be judged not by their profits or their products, but by their impact on humanity. Sounds like what we're trying to move right now, right? But it was written by, or it was said by DJ Dupree, who started at Herman Miller in 1909, and that's in your book. And, you know, some companies have been getting it right for a really, really long time, and that quote reminds us of it. But here's the other quote. You'll recognize this too, Judy. Perhaps the greatest inhibitor of influencing capitalism as we experience now is the failure to imagine anything different. And I believe that's a Judy Samuelson quote from her book. I think it ties in very nicely with my book, Be Fearless. If we're all just a little more fearless and can imagine a different future, we can make progress. So Judy, thanks so much for your time with us today. It's been a real joy to hear from you. And I can't recommend the book strongly enough. The 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Real Value in a Changing World. So thank you, Judy. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you very much.